The first thing I remember is the smell. Not of the stale air in the lecture hall, not the comforting scent of old paper and dust motes catching the afternoon light. No. It was the smell of chlorine and a cheap, synthetic lemon cleaner they use in the motel bathrooms. It gets into everything. It clings to your clothes. It's the smell of starting over in the worst way. I remember standing there, my hand hovering over the key card slot, staring at the number 117 engraved on a cheap plastic plate. A single queen bed, a tiny fridge, a window looking out onto a parking lot. That was it. This wasn't a bad vacation. This wasn't a low point after a divorce or a layoff. This was self-inflicted. I was Professor Elias Vance. Tenured. Published. I had spent 15 years in front of a whiteboard drawing perfect bell curves and explaining the efficient market hypothesis to students who mostly looked bored. My life was defined by control, by certainty, by theory. That's the joke, isn't it? I could write a textbook on how to avoid this moment. I could give a master class on fiscal responsibility. And yet here I was, key card in hand, zero in the bank, and a knot of pure, sickening fear in my stomach. But the fear wasn't about the money. Not yet. The real fear was about being wrong. It started with a phrase I heard 1,000 times. Every semester. I would ask my class, bright-eyed kids with too much inherited optimism, what's the biggest barrier to financial success? They'd give the answers I taught them. Lack of discipline, high interest rates, poor saving habits. And then one kid, always one kid, would raise their hand and say, luck. Or, the system is rigged, professor. Or the one that finally broke me, if you aren't born with it, you can't make it. It's too late for the rest of us. They saw my success, the nice suit, the nice house, the summer in Tuscany, as evidence of my privilege. They saw my theories as abstract nonsense that only worked if you already had a safety net. And I realized something terrifying. I had never, not once, lived without a safety net. I got my first grant at 23. I bought my first duplex on an FHA loan with money my father had saved for me. I had always had a salary. Always. My entire financial fortress was built on a foundation of inherited stability. My knowledge? It was an untested blueprint. How could I lecture on resilience when I had never been truly tested? How could I teach them about building from zero when I had never been there myself? I couldn't. I was a fraud in a tweed jacket. The idea started small. A persistent itch. A hypothetical in a late-night grading session. What if I really did it? What if I took the textbook, my own textbook, and tested it against zero? It became an obsession. It stopped being an academic exercise and started feeling like a moral necessity. I had to prove to myself and to those skeptical kids that the principles were real, that knowledge and grit were more powerful than luck. I cashed out my entire life. Every cent of my retirement fund, my savings, my investment portfolio. The whole thing. It was a substantial number. A beautiful, comfortable number. I wired 99% of it to a blind trust that would hold it untouched for 1 year. The only access I had was to a small monthly payment that covered the mortgage on my house, just enough to keep the bank happy, the only bridge I allowed myself to maintain. And then I took the remaining 1%. It was $1,500. I resigned. No big farewell. Just a cold, formal letter to the dean, citing personal reasons. He looked at me like I was having a mental breakdown, and maybe I was. That $1,500 was everything. It had to cover food, transportation, and a place to sleep. It had to be the seed of a new empire. It was my theory on the firing line. The day I walked out of that university building, I felt an almost manic energy. Freedom. The sheer, terrifying weight of self-determination. I had shed the skin of Professor Vance. But the manic energy didn't last. It never does. The elevator ride down felt different. The sunlight hitting the perfectly manicured lawn felt like a spotlight mocking me. When I turned the key to my empty, prepaid motel room, room 117, the reality hit. I looked at the cheap laminated desk. I pulled out my laptop, my only tool, my only connection to the world of information I had once mastered. I sat down and I stared at a blank spreadsheet. Goal: rebuild a stable financial foundation in 12 months. Starting capital: $1,500. Assets: one old laptop, a worn suitcase of clothes, and a head full of theories. The theory, my life's work, said this was possible. It said that financial success was a repeatable process, not a lottery win. The reality, my hands were shaking too badly to type the first line. I didn't smell like chlorine or cheap lemon cleaner yet. I smelled like expensive cologne and institutional arrogance. That night I cried. Not because I was poor, but because I finally understood the crushing, debilitating shame of having to choose between ramen and bus fare. I knew the theory, but I had never been forced to live the curriculum. That was the hook. That was the moment the experiment stopped being an academic stunt and started being a fight for survival. The first rule of rebuilding wealth is, protect your capital. In my case, $1,500. That meant the motel was a temporary, desperate measure. That $55 a night burned a hole in my pocket. Every single morning I woke up, I was $55 poorer. That's a speed of failure I hadn't accounted for in my models. My first few days were a blur of stupid mistakes. Mistakes that would have earned a student an F in my class. Mistake 1, over-leveraging my time. I spent the first day trying to land a high-level consulting gig. I polished my resume. I sent out dozens of emails to contacts I had neglected for years. Former students, CEOs who had invited me to speak at their conferences. No response. I was Elias Vance, the respected academic. But in the real world, without the university name attached, I was just an unemployed theorist. Nobody was hiring a professor for a $500 an hour gig when they thought he had quit his job for philosophical reasons. They saw me as a risk, or worse, an eccentric. I wasted 3 precious days waiting for the phone to ring. 3 days, or $165 gone. Food was cheap takeout. I couldn't cook in the room. I was bleeding money just to survive in a place designed to keep me sheltered. Mistake 2, the pride trap. I needed immediate cash flow. My theories said to leverage my expertise. But my expertise was too expensive. I remembered a chapter 1 wrote on micro-income streams. Get a job. Any job. Deliver pizzas. Drive for a rideshare service. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of pulling up to my old neighborhood, the tree-lined streets, the perfect lawns, and seeing a former student or a colleague while I was dropping off a lukewarm pepperoni pizza. The humiliation felt like a physical weight on my chest. Pride. It's the single most expensive item in the financial world. Cost me another 2 days. Another $110 wasted on fear. I had to get out of that motel. The burn rate was unsustainable. My entire remaining capital was a spreadsheet ticking down to zero. I drove until I found a long-stay hotel outside the city limits. Cheaper. Cleaner. Still soul-crushing. It was $350 a week. Better. But still 4 weeks of rent and I was done. I sat in that new, anonymous room, and the shame finally broke through the pride. My theories were useless if I couldn't even execute the first step, survival. I looked in the mirror and I didn't see Professor Vance. I saw a scared man in a motel room, holding a master's degree in failure. I deleted the high-paying consultant emails. I opened a gig worker app. I signed up to deliver groceries. No, I wasn't driving a BMW anymore. I was riding a slightly rusty second-hand bicycle I'd bought for $80 outside a pawn shop. I didn't care. The chlorine was still there, but now, mixed with the sweat and the sheer effort of pedaling a huge order of bottled water up a hill, it finally smelled like something real. It smelled like work. The first delivery took me an hour. I got a $5 tip. $5. My old salary was, 50 times that amount per hour? I made the calculations in my head automatically. The disparity was a punch to the gut. But then a strange thing happened. I looked at the $5 bill in my hand. It was dirty, creased, real. And for the first time since I started this stupid, arrogant experiment, I felt the tiniest, most fragile flicker of hope. I didn't earn that $5 because of my pedigree. I earned it because I executed. I found the weird organic milk. I navigated the confusing apartment complex. I solved the problem. It was micro-victory. It was proof that the smallest units of effort, the ones people who are comfortable ignore, actually matter. That night, I rode back to the long-stay hotel, my legs burning. I pulled out my laptop. I finally typed in the first line of my experiment ledger. Day 4, gross income $51. Expenses, $7. Net profit, $44. I had finally turned the corner from theory to action. But that was just the start. The real test of the theory was about to begin, and it was going to require far more than just pedaling a bike. It was going to require me to face the biggest lie I ever told myself. That lie was betrayal. Not by a friend, but by the one thing I trusted most, my own intellect. I thought I could outsmart the hustle. I thought my degrees were a bulletproof vest. I was wrong. And the financial price of that arrogance was about to get much, much higher. The bike was my new office. It was freedom, but it was also a leash tethering me to the pavement, forcing me into the most brutal kind of marginal cost analysis. I was delivering groceries, sure. But I was also optimizing routes, tracking peak pay hours, and calculating the exact point where the energy spent on the bike exceeded the revenue generated by the order. This wasn't just physical labor, it was a real-world algorithm I was finally executing. The theory was simple: consistency trumps intensity. I had to show up every day. I had to earn something, anything, to make sure that $350 weekly rent didn't crush me. But the real world is messy. The real world doesn't care about your models. One afternoon, I was carrying 3 heavy bags, including a carton of a dozen eggs, up the narrow, uneven steps of an old duplex. I was exhausted, my quads screaming, and my focus was shot. I tripped. It wasn't a bad fall, just a stumble. But those eggs hit the concrete landing with a sickening, wet crunch. Failure. Not just financial but deeply, personally humiliating. I stood there staring at the ruined groceries, the yellow yolk bleeding into the paper bags. I was a professor who couldn't even manage to carry eggs. The customer was surprisingly kind, a young woman with a tired smile. She just sighed, said, "It happens," and accepted the remaining bags. But the app penalized me. I had to pay for the damaged goods out of my pocket. That tiny moment of clumsiness cost me $18 in damaged inventory, and worse, it gave me a low rating, which meant fewer good orders coming my way. That night, lying awake on the stiff motel bed, staring at the ceiling and the flickering neon sign outside, the true weight of living paycheck to paycheck finally hit me. It wasn't the total debt that kills you. It's the fragility. It's knowing that one mistake, one flat tire, one clumsy step, one unexpected $10 fee, can send your entire shaky structure collapsing. My financial models never accounted for the cost of exhaustion. They didn't account for the days when the humidity was so thick you felt like you were breathing soup, or the mental fog that made simple subtraction impossible. I had to adapt. I had to stop thinking like a professor and start thinking like a survivor. I managed to stabilize my income. I was making about $600 a week after gas and food, but my rent was still eating up the majority of it. I was gaining ground, but at a punishing pace. I was building a sandcastle just above the high tide line. I needed speed. I needed leverage. My old life started whispering temptations. I thought about the thousands of articles I had written on short-term trading strategies. I had always preached discipline, diversification, and long-term holding. But now the tiny screen of my laptop felt like a casino. If I just put $100 into that one stock, if I tried a little bit of short-term options trading, I could hear my own voice in the lecture hall. Never gamble with survival capital. But desperate times make hypocrites of us all. I convinced myself I wasn't gambling. I was applying superior knowledge. I took $300, a full 2 days of cycling and sweating, and I bought a handful of volatile low-price stocks. It was exhilarating. The tension was sharper than any bike ride. For 48 hours it worked. The stock jumped. I made $75. A 25% return. I felt a rush of vindication. See, the mind still works. I sold it immediately, pocketed the cash, and felt a dangerous surge of arrogance. I was too smart to fail this way. So I tried again. This time I went bigger. I took $500 and went into a slightly more obscure sector I had researched extensively years ago. It wasn't luck. It was a calculated risk. A beautiful, mathematically sound risk. And the market crushed me. A competitor's announcement blindsided the stock, dropping its value like a stone. I watched the $500 turn into $150 in 2 terrifying hours. I sold, swallowing the loss. The panic was immediate and physical. That money wasn't a concept. It was a week and a half of rent. It was the difference between holding on to this meager life and having to sleep in my car. The trading account was empty, but the lesson was brutally full. Theoretical knowledge is worthless without emotional control. When your survival is on the line, the smartest people make the dumbest decisions. Desperation is the ultimate market irrationality. I had failed the most basic principle of finance. I had let greed and pride hijack my discipline. I slammed the laptop shut. I didn't turn it on for 3 days. I went back to the bike and I worked with a quiet, burning rage. Every mile I pedaled was a penance. Every order I delivered was me earning back the money I had thrown away with my academic arrogance. The shame of the trading loss was intense, but it wasn't the most painful part of this journey. The real pain came from the isolation. I had deliberately cut off my old life. I told my friends and colleagues I was taking a sabbatical to write a book. A noble academic lie. The problem was my ex-wife, Sarah. We had separated amicably years ago, but we were still financially tied by the mortgage on the house, the one constant I had allowed myself. The bank calls were getting more aggressive. The single payment I was making from the blind trust, the one necessary bridge I'd left, was covering the principal and interest, but there were mounting fees, insurance, property taxes, that I had foolishly forgotten to account for in my initial budget. One night the phone rang. It was Sarah. I answered, my voice tight, trying to sound normal, like the successful professor I wasn't. Elias, what is going on with the mortgage? Her voice wasn't angry, it was laced with fear. That was worse. I started to give her the prepared speech. Just a small hiccup, tax assessment was higher than expected, I'll handle it next month. But she interrupted me. The bank sent me a letter. They said we're behind. They used the word default. My carefully constructed academic experiment was now threatening to drag the one person I genuinely cared about into my self-imposed ruin. I hadn't just emptied my own account, I was jeopardizing her stability, her credit score, her peace of mind. The silence on the line felt like a physical chasm. Sarah, I finally said, the professor's voice gone, replaced by something rough and small. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't say, I'm living in a motel and delivering groceries to prove a point to a bunch of undergrads. The absurdity was too cruel. Just fix it, Elias, she whispered. Please. I don't care what you're doing. Just fix the house. She hung up and I sat there paralyzed. I realized that my experiment, designed to prove the power of knowledge, was instead exposing my profound lack of wisdom. Wisdom isn't about knowing the formula, it's about knowing the consequences of your actions on others. I was living in a $350 a week cage, and yet, the shadow of my multi-thousand-dollar mortgage was threatening to tear down the entire foundation I was trying to rebuild. The experiment had a clock, 1 year. But the mortgage had a deadline, 60 days until serious foreclosure proceedings began. The pressure was no longer philosophical, it was existential. I had to find a way to make enough money not just to survive, but to outrun my own past. This was the ultimate test. It wasn't about the theories anymore. It was about whether I had the courage to save what I broke. And the bike wasn't going to cut it. I needed to leverage the one thing I still had, my mind, but this time I had to use it with humility, not arrogance. The phone call with Sarah changed everything. It was no longer about proving a theory, it was about preventing an actual, tangible disaster. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, immediate clarity. I was facing a $6,000 problem, the amount needed to clear the arrears, fees and penalties on the mortgage, and the bike was only giving me pocket change. I needed to turn my intellect into income, but not through the destructive pride of the stock market. I had to use my knowledge but apply it with humility. I thought back to the core of my failure. I couldn't get a high-level consulting job because I had no structure, no reputation outside the university walls. I was a man asking for favors. I needed to solve a small, immediate problem for someone else for a fee. I pulled out my laptop and scrolled through the gig sites again, past the grocery deliveries. I looked for something I could do from the motel room, something that paid for knowledge, not labor. I found a niche request, personalized budgeting and debt assessment. The typical ad on these sites was filled with motivational fluff. I changed my approach. I didn't advertise myself as Professor Vance. I advertised as the analyst who lost everything. My new profile description was raw, honest, and terrifying. I spent 15 years teaching financial theory. Then, I had to use it to rebuild my life from $1,500. I know your debt cycle because I've lived the terror of having $5 in my account. I don't offer platitudes. I offer a brutal, customized plan to stop the bleeding. Flat fee, $150 for a full 90-minute crisis assessment. I used the language of betrayal and redemption. I wasn't selling a lecture. I was selling the wisdom of a man who had failed catastrophically. The first response came within an hour. It wasn't a CEO. It was a single mother named Maria, working 2 jobs, buried under medical debt and credit card interest. We met over a video call. I was in my dingy motel room, using a cheap backdrop to hide the stained wallpaper. Maria was tired, sitting in a messy kitchen looking ready to cry. She didn't need a lecture on APR. She needed permission to be scared. I feel like I'm drowning, Elias. I just keep moving money around. I don't even know where it all goes, she admitted, her voice cracking. My old self would have launched into a detailed explanation of debt consolidation and amortization schedules. My new self said, forget the formulas for a minute, Maria. Tell me, what's the one thing that keeps you awake at 3 a.m.? She didn't mention the interest rates. She mentioned the look in her kids' eyes when she had to say no to new shoes. That was the turning point for me. My theory had been too sterile. I finally understood that finance is not about numbers, it's about human dignity. For 90 minutes, I helped her face her shame. We went through her statements line by line, identifying the real pain points. We cut the 2 highest interest, lowest impact items. We sold a small, unnecessary possession to create a tiny cash buffer, a financial oxygen tank. The plan wasn't revolutionary. It was simple, ruthless, and built on humility. When the call ended, she wasn't rich, but she was empowered. She paid me the $150 and she left a review that changed everything. Elias didn't make me feel stupid. He made me feel like I could fight back. He's the real deal. The reviews piled up. People weren't buying my credentials, they were buying my pain. They connected to the reality of the struggle. I stopped cycling for groceries completely. I spent 12 hours a day on video calls, doing 5 or 6 assessments. I was finally using my expertise, but filtered through the gritty reality of the last few months. The money started to move. $150 times 6 clients a day is $900 a day. It felt like a flood after the starvation diet of the bike deliveries. I moved out of the long-stay hotel and into a small, furnished apartment. I upgraded my laptop and bought a professional microphone. I was investing every cent back into the business, accelerating the momentum. I was building a new reputation, the coach of crisis. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, fueled by instant coffee and the adrenaline of the fight. The exhaustion was still there, but now it was a productive exhaustion, the ache of building, not the ache of failing. Within 4 weeks of launching the service, I had amassed $15,500 in my operating account. It felt surreal. I had rebuilt a substantial sum faster than I had ever imagined, simply by taking the shame of my failure and turning it into service. But the $6,000 mortgage default payment was still looming. I had the money, but I knew I couldn't just send the payment without addressing the lie. I called Sarah again. This time I didn't use the prepared speech. "Sarah, I need to tell you what I did." I told her everything. The experiment, the $1,500, the motel, the eggs, the trading mistake, the shame, the fear of losing her house. The line was silent for a long time. I braced myself for rage, disgust, or pity. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "You risked everything, Elias. Everything we ever built together for a lesson plan." "I know," I said, the words barely audible. It was the most arrogant, selfish thing I have ever done. I needed to know if the theories were real, and I found out they are, but they only work when you drop the ego and embrace the struggle. And I didn't realize until it almost cost you everything. "You could have just volunteered at a shelter," she said, a hint of dry humor in her voice. "I needed the pressure," I admitted. "I needed to be hungry again. I needed the shame of the chlorine smell. Then the relief. I paid the $6,000 this morning. The mortgage is current. It's fixed." "Thank you, Elias," she said, and I heard the sincerity. "Now, are you coming home?" I paused. The truth was, the experiment wasn't over. I had rebuilt wealth, yes, but I hadn't rebuilt purpose. The year wasn't up. I had to see it through. "No," I told her gently. "Not yet. I started this to prove a point about consistency and discipline. I have to finish the curriculum. But I'm building something real now, Sarah. Something that helps people fight back. I'll be home, but when I get there, I won't be the same man." The phone call ended on a note of fragile understanding. I had earned the money back, but more importantly, I had earned a tiny bit of trust back. The money saved the house. The truth saved my soul. I had found my new purpose. It wasn't to teach students in a classroom, it was to coach people in crisis. The real transformation was beginning. It was time for the final, most important phase of the experiment. I had the money. I had a legitimate business. I had averted the disaster with Sarah. The academic experiment was financially successful. I was no longer a man living by the grace of a bike and ramen. But the final test wasn't about the balance sheet. It was about impact. My coaching sessions were filling up. I was constantly on calls, diving into debt assessments and creating ruthless budgets. I was a drill sergeant of discipline, and people were responding to the honesty of my struggle. But I realized that I couldn't scale this personal, one-on-one intensity. The number of people drowning was too vast. I was helping a trickle when the world needed a fire hose. I looked at the notes from the last few months. Every mistake I'd made, the pride, the quick fix attempt, the shame of the chlorine-scented motel, it was all a curriculum. A real-world MBA taught in the school of hard knocks. I took the money I had earned, the money that was supposed to secure my return to my old life, and I invested it in one thing: my voice. I started a YouTube channel. Not with glossy stock footage or a green screen. Just me sitting in that small, sparsely furnished apartment, talking directly into a camera. I called it The Real World Analyst. The first video was titled, I was a tenured professor. I quit my job and lost everything to prove a point. This is what happened. I didn't hold back. I told the story of the $1,500, the arrogance that preceded it, the crushing realization in room 117, the shame of the eggs, and the stupidity of the $500 trading loss. I didn't teach theory. I taught humility. I didn't talk about portfolio diversification. I talked about the $5 bill earned after 2 hours of back-breaking work and how precious that small amount felt. I talked about the cost of pride and how it kept me in the wrong, expensive motel for 3 days. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The comments weren't focused on my financial formulas. They focused on the emotional truth. I'm crying. I'm $40,000 in debt and I feel that shame. Thank you for making me feel like I can fight back. I thought I was the only one who tried the quick fix trade. I lost my rent money. You saved me from doing it again. I was using my failure not as a confession but as a tool. I was building the fire hose. My audience wasn't looking for a handout. They were looking for a map drawn by someone who had actually gotten lost in the dark. This became the true climax of the experiment. The moment I stopped solving my own problem and started using my journey to solve theirs. The knowledge I had always possessed finally found its purpose outside of academia. I was teaching the Real curriculum now. Financial success is 80% psychology and 20% mechanics. The mechanics, budgeting, saving, investing, were easy. I had taught them for years. The psychology, the fear, the shame, the pride, the self-sabotage, that was the hard part. That was the curriculum I had paid $1,500 in a year of my life to learn. I realized I didn't need the university's endorsement. I didn't need the tweed jacket. The experience of failure was the only accreditation I needed. I was no longer a professor of theory, I was a teacher of reality. 12 months came and went. The day I finally allowed the blind trust to release my original savings, the money hit my account, but the number felt hollow. It was a substantial amount, enough to buy back my old life 10 times over. I looked at the number, then I looked at the community I had built. Thousands of people who were implementing my real-world budget. The one built on aggressive debt repayment and radical self-honesty. I realized the money didn't matter anymore. The victory wasn't in getting the savings back. The victory was in the fact that I no longer needed them. I had built a new, stronger, more meaningful source of income from nothing but honesty and effort. I went back to the old house. Sarah met me at the door. She looked at me not with pity, but with a strange mix of respect and concern. I was thinner. My hands were rougher from the work. I was wearing an inexpensive shirt instead of the bespoke suits. You finished your book, she said, nodding toward my laptop case. I finished the experiment, I corrected her. And the book is online for free. I didn't go back to the university. I had transcended the institution. My classroom was now the entire world. I kept the YouTube channel, making long-form, honest and painful videos about the psychology of money. I monetized it, earning a healthy income that far surpassed my old salary, but I always kept my core consulting material free. My final lesson to myself was this. Discipline and consistency are the only two market forces you can truly control. Everything else, luck, the economy, interest rates, is external noise. I didn't become rich by winning the lottery or by making a brilliant trade. I became financially secure by mastering the mundane, budgeting, working hard, and facing the truth about my own worst enemy, my ego. I sit here now still telling my story. Not because I need to prove a point to a skeptical class, but because I know someone out there is staring at an eviction notice, smelling chlorine, and thinking they're alone. I was Elias Vance, the professor who had the answers. Then I was just Elias, the fool who lost everything. Now I am just Elias, the man who finally learned that the most important number in finance isn't your net worth. It's your net freedom. And you don't buy freedom with money. You build it with humility, consistency, and the courage to admit you were wrong. I didn't become rich. I became free, and that's worth more than all the money I ever saved, lost, or earned. That's the one truth that will always work, no matter the market, no matter the economy, and no matter the debt.